Chapter 13 of The Golden Bough by George Gibbs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Oliva. A scent. George Senf was leonine. Aroused suddenly from his bed, the disorder of his long white hair and beard gave him a singularly wild and ferocious aspect. But he got out a long-stemmed pipe, and after lighting it, settled down with a steady eye to listen to the story that Liedermann and Roland told him. He heard them through to the end, putting in keen questions or incisive remarks here and there, which did much to reassure Roland that their case was in capable hands. This was a leader of men, a thinker and a man of action, and his comprehension of all aspects of the situation and the definite manner of his decisions left no room to doubt that he believed a crisis to be impending between the forces he represented and the powers of the government which stood behind Kodkina. When Liedermann and Roland had finished, he sat for a long while on his bed, smoking, his brows frowning, staring at the opposite wall. At last he waved them away. "Go," he said shortly. "You will need your sleep. My work begins now, at once. Tomorrow we will have a report from Fräulein Korasoff. We need her. The meeting of the committee is tomorrow night. Come here when you have slept and we will plan further. Good night." And so the two men returned to the Russischer Hof and found the sleep of which they were both much in need. But it was with some mental reservations that Roland went to bed, for he had vowed that until Tanya was found he would never rest in peace. He had seen something of the double nature of this Gregory Hochwald, and the possible dangers to which she might be subjected filled him constantly with vague alarms. But he realized that he must rest to be effective on the morrow. If his conscience troubled him, he had no chance to be aware of it, for he was sound asleep as soon as his head touched the pillow. Liedermann was hammering upon the door of the adjoining room, which he occupied before Roland awoke, and sat up in his bed, blinking at the light of broad day. And after a hurried bath and breakfast, they called upon Zoya Rochal and hastened to the house of Georg Senf. They found the socialist leader in his bedroom, which was blue with the tobacco smoke of a secret conference of several men, three of them leaders, as Roland afterward discovered, in labor organizations allied to the Socialist Democratic and Socialist Revolutionary parties. As the newcomers entered, there was a silence except for the words of greeting of Georg Senf, and they all rose and made place. One of them wore a workman's blouse, and the others were shabbily dressed, but in all three Roland noted the same characteristics: the broad brows of intelligence, the firm lips of resolution, the clear, penetrating gaze of men accustomed to think for themselves. "This is Herr Roland," said Georg Senf briefly, "the new president of the Order of Nemi, who has come from Switzerland on this sudden mission." The men bowed and shook the hand of the American gravely. "You will not find Munich lacking in ardor, Herr Roland. Our followers are many and we are strong," said one named Conrad Weiss, who was chief telegrapher of the Munich post office. "You will need to be strong," said Roland, "for there is every sign that a test of your power is coming soon." "We are ready for it, Herr Roland," rumbled the deep bass of Herr Hofner, who wore the blouse. "And the people of Bavaria are behind us. They are sick, war-weary, and the time has come." "Have you arms, ammunition?" asked Roland pointedly. The question seemed to have probed deep below the surface, for no one replied at once, and then spoke Herr Jäger, a smallish man with long hair and the dark eyes of a dreamer. "Arms, ammunition, yes, perhaps, here and there. But arms are verboten." It is necessary that we move with caution, nor do we wish to win with arms or ammunition, Herr Roland. Stronger weapons, poverty, hunger, the rights of one man against another, they will triumph in the end." Roland assumed an air of dignity he was far from feeling, for deep in his heart he realized, as these men did not, that strong as their organization was, or firm its affiliations, the time would be long in coming for any nation which so feared the verboten sign. He was sorry for them, but he dared not tell them so. He had that maddening inclination to laugh, which came to him sometimes upon the most sober occasions. But he bowed his head deeply, saying nothing, which, as everyone knows, is the part of wisdom. In this he added to the respect with which they held his office, and when Georg Senf drew the meeting to a close, offered him all the help that was in their power to find the money that had been taken. "That is well," finished Senf. "You will carry out your instructions. You, Herr Weiss, to the telegraph office and summon all leaders for tonight by the harmless code of initials. The meeting is at 10, so lose no time. You, Herr Jäger, to your factory. You, Herr Hofner, will keep in readiness for a further call. Herr Berghof will please remain." Now, for the first time, Roland noted a figure in the corner of the room, who rose as the others went out and came forward at a sign from Herr Senf, and was presented to the new arrivals. Georg Senf, relighting his long-stemmed pipe, paced the floor before the fireplace. "I have been busy, my friends, while you have slept," he said. "This matter of the money brooks no delay. In 10 minutes after you left this house last night I had made my plans. Our comrades live all about me here, and by daylight our different leaders had been notified. By breakfast time thousands of members of our organizations were combing the city in all directions, every hotel, every pension. An hour ago we met with some success." "You found her?" broke in Roland eagerly. "Only to lose her again." As Roland sprang up, Senf raised his hand. "One moment. It was through no fault of our own, or of Herr Berghof's here, who could not, of course, have known that Fräulein Korasoff's interests and mine were identical." Herr Berghof, a thin, ferret-like person, smiled and squinted as Roland glared at him. "You saw her, Herr Berghof?" But Georg Senf broke in again, with maddening, methodical, Teuton insistence. "All things in order, Herr Roland," he said calmly. "A little patience and you shall know all. Herr Berghof is a social democrat, but not a member of the Order of Nemi. He has been brought here by Herr Weiss a while ago, somewhat against his will. But he has replied to our questions upon the condition that the matter is kept secret." "Will you relate what happened last night, Herr Berghof?" The little man cleared his throat, squinted, and nodded politely. "I am a stranger in Munich, a Swiss from Basel, but I have much interest in the socialist cause. Democracy is very near my heart, and if I can help——" He glanced at Roland, who had risen, his patience nearly exhausted. "You will please proceed directly to the matter in hand," said Senf placidly. "Fräulein Korasoff came to the Bayerischer Hof last night?" Zoya Rochal shot a triumphant glance at Roland, but his gaze was fixed on Berghof. "Yes, Herr Senf," the man replied. "I am connected with the management of the hotel at about 11 with a gentleman who called himself Herr Hochwald." "Hochwald," muttered Roland in surprise. "That was the name also given by the gentleman awaiting him in the south drawing room, who said he was expecting his arrival." "Ah, I see." Fräulein Korasoff was taken at once to a room number 221 upon the second floor. She carried a large suitcase. I myself conducted Herr Hochwald to the south drawing room, where a visitor was awaiting him. They sat conversing at once in a low tone of voice. As I was not wanted, I gave Herr Hochwald the key to his room, which was upon the third floor of the hotel, at some distance from that occupied by Fräulein Korasoff. I see. And then? And then nothing. I went to sleep. I was very tired. You must understand, Herr Senf, we are very lacking in service at the hotel, and upon the day before I had been on duty.
Proceed, Herr Berghoff,
growled Lederman.
At what time did you see Herr Hochwald again?
Oh, yes. It must have been at least an hour or more later. Herr Hochwald, accompanied by Herr Förster, the man who had met him in the south drawing room, came running down the stairs and awoke me, swearing in a manner such as I have thought was only practiced by officers in the army, and demanding to be let at once into room number 221. The proceeding was most unusual, especially as Herr Hochwald had been so particular in ordering that Fräulein Korasoff was not to be disturbed by anyone. They had knocked upon her door, they said, but had not been able to get a reply, and feared that something had happened to the lady. So I procured my ring of pass keys and followed them up the stairs. The matter was delicate, and one which might have involved me in much difficulty with the proprietor of the hotel. But when I hesitated, Herr Hochwald raved and swore again, knocking so that others nearby might easily have been awakened. And then, thinking that perhaps something might really have happened to the Fräulein, I found the proper key and opened the door. The clerk paused to get his breath, and Lederman swore softly. The Fräulein was sitting upon the edge of the bed, fully dressed, he went on, as though aroused from a sleep of utter exhaustion. But she gained her dignity and self-possession almost at once, and quite naturally demanded the meaning of the intrusion. "The suitcase!" cried Herr Hochwald. "You have the suitcase here?" Fräulein Korasoff looked a little bewildered. "The suitcase? Yes, I have my suitcase here. But what—" At that moment Herr Förster espied the bag of Fräulein Korasoff upon the table, and running across the room fell upon it eagerly and opened it. There was nothing in it but a few pieces of linen, and Hochwald let forth another of his mad cries. "The money!" he said. "What have you done with the money?" The Fräulein had now risen and stood very pale and angry. "I don't understand you," she said quietly. "The money? What should I know about the money?" Herr Hochwald stood a moment, his face working, trying to compose himself, and then turning to the officer, who stood uncertainly. "Search the room," he ordered. "Everywhere. It must be here." Fräulein Korasoff stood immovable. "It is a pity, Herr Hochwald," she said coolly, "that you have neither honor nor decency." "What have you done with it?" he went on, trying to keep his composure. "Tell me now, and all may yet be well." "I know nothing," she replied. Herr Hochwald stared at her a moment, and then, as though to himself, "This is a grave matter. We shall take further steps." And seeing me standing beside the door, he seemed suddenly to realize that I had seen and heard all that had happened, for he frowned and ordered me from the room. "Go," he muttered, "and order a cab at once. Fräulein Korasoff, you will descend with me. Herr Förster, you will stay. Continue the search and question the servants. You have full authority. Is it understood?" "At your orders, Herr Hochwald," said the other. That was all I heard, for I went below and ordered the cab, into which Herr Hochwald and the Fräulein entered and were driven away. The man paused, and there was a moment of silence, when a storm of questions assailed him.
"The directions of the driver,"
cried Lederman. "Herr Förster found nothing?" asked Zoya Rochal. "The servants were questioned," demanded Senf. "I did not hear the directions of the driver," said Herr Berghof, with a shifting glance at Roland. "The man who conducted the Fräulein to her room could shed no light upon the matter." "But you? Did Herr Förster not question you?" asked Roland keenly. "Yes, he questioned this morning, and I answered him. It is not healthy not to answer the questions of one in such authority." There was another silence, baffled it seemed on the part of the questioners. Herr Berghof took up his hat and rose. Roland no longer smiled. Lederman rocked to and fro from one foot to the other by the mantel shelf. Zoya Rochal nervously lighted a cigarette. "One moment, Herr Berghof," said Roland, whose mind had been tracing the interstices of the puzzle in his own American way. "You say that this Herr Förster has questioned the servants of the hotel?" Herr Berghof hesitated a moment. "One or two only. What was the use? The Fräulein had been there but an hour or more." "But you seem to forget that in that hour much happened," said Roland. "If that money was taken from the valise of Herr Hochwald, it was taken before he reached the hotel, not afterward. If Fräulein Korasoff took it, He paused a moment, then went on quickly. "She had a valise, you say. Empty?" Herr Berghof hesitated again, and shot a quick glance over his shoulder toward the closed door behind him. But Roland had risen and now stood beside it. "You say the suitcase was empty?" repeated Roland sternly. Berghof swallowed uneasily. "Except for one or two articles of apparel, yes." "Then where did the other bag come from?" asked Roland suddenly. Berghof's little eyes squinted rapidly and he moistened his lips nervously. "The other one?" "The one in which the money was removed?" I don't understand." "Follow me closely, Herr Berghof. You have said that Fräulein Korasoff carried her suitcase to her room. Were there servants to perform that service?" "Yes." "Fräulein Korasoff had the money in that suitcase. Herr Hochwald knew that she had taken it, or he would not have gone to her room at night with you and forced the door. She did take it. But who helped her?" "I'm sure Are there bells in the bedrooms?" "Yes, but—" "Where do they ring?"
In the office. It is an English system."
"Were there any calls between 11 and 12:30?" Roland was shooting his questions at the bewildered clerk like thunderbolts, and the man seemed to have grown more and more anxious. "Calls. I dropped into a doze in my chair, as I have said. I cannot—"
"Think."
"Yes, a call or two, but I was half asleep."
"A call? Who answered it?" Berghof rubbed his head with unsteady fingers, but replied with reluctance.
"Yes, there was a call."
"Did you answer it?"
"No. It is the duty of the valet or night porter."
"Did the night porter go?"
I presume so."
"The night porter, what is his name?" Herr Berghof now seemed truly alarmed and for a moment refused to reply. "What is his name?" thundered Roland.
"Dreilich,"
said Berghof sullenly. "Is he on duty now?"
"No."
"Can you find him?"
"No."
"You shall try. I will go with you. He is the man who has taken the money." Lederman and Senf, who had followed the rapid deductions of the American with astonishment, rose eagerly, and Zoya Rochal laughed her admiration. "You are right," said Senf.
"It is worth trying,"
muttered Lederman. "There's no time to be lost," said Roland quickly, and then to Senf, "Have your men been sent to trace the cab?" "No, Herr Roland, since the money was the most important." Roland reached down into his pocket, pulled forth the talisman of Nemi, and crashed it down upon the table. "If there's any virtue in this, if Nemi is anything but an empty word, if its leader is your master as well as your slave, then do as I command," he said sternly. Herr Senf gazed at the coin and then looked up at the dominating figure before him. "What more can I do?" "Find me the man who drove that cab. And you, Herr Liedermann, give me money. I need it." Max Liedermann glanced at Zoya Rochal, then at Roland, and without a word obeyed. "I will go with you, Herr Roland," said Zoya Rochal decisively. But Roland was already out of the door, his hand on Herr Berghoff's arm. Georg Senf ran his fingers through his long hair and looked at Liedermann as Roland went out. "If we have longed for a leader, Herr Liedermann, the god of democracy has sent us one. Some of his fire has got into my ancient bones. I will follow and obey." Liedermann grunted and glanced at the door through which Zoya Rochal had departed.
"He is keen,"
he muttered grudgingly.
"Moreover, his judgment is excellent. Our case falls without Fräulein Korasoff. We must find her. I myself will go to the cab stand in the Maximilianstrasse. Call Herr Hofner, if you please, and I will give him instructions." In the meanwhile, Roland and Zoya Rochal with Herr Berghoff found a cab. The Swiss, at first sullen and inclined to balk Roland's plans, was speedily brought into submission by the American's determined attitude and the exhibition of an automatic, the mere sight of which made him become more obliging and cheerful. And they found the lodgings of the porter Drellich at last, and Drellich himself quite drunk upon his bed in his room. But he became more sober and quite alarmed when the purpose of the visit was disclosed to him. He was a man of 60, servile of manner, but at first furtive and obstinate, giving evasive replies. But Zoya Rochal, who was resourceful, informed him that she was an agent of the government, and the man collapsed.
"Against my better judgment I did it, Fräulein," he stammered. "Money is not made so easily nowadays."
"Fräulein Korasoff gave you money?" asked Roland eagerly.
500 marks. I give it to you. Here it is."
And with trembling hands he brought it forth from a greasy notebook in his pocket. "Tell us what you did, and you may keep this money," said Roland quickly. Drellich straightened hopefully and looked from one to the other.
"I did this thing in ignorance. How could I know that the Fräulein was working against the interests of the fatherland?"
"Speak. What happened?" ordered Roland.
"I was called to the office by Herr Berghoff to reply to a call upon the indicator. He will tell you that. I noted the number and went to room number 221. The Fräulein within looked out at me, and I could see that she was very much disturbed. Then she called me within the room and shut the door behind me. As the lock caught, I too was startled, for I could not know what was to happen. She produced from the pocket of her coat this note, which she held up that I might look. 'I want a suitcase or a bag of the size of this one,' said she. 'Bring it here at once, and obey my further instructions, and I will give you the money.' I remembered that there were some old suitcases in the porter's room, long unclaimed, and it did not take me more than a few minutes to unlock one of them with my keys, to empty it, and return to room number 221. I am sure that I have done nothing which could put me under suspicion of having done other than a service to a guest of the hotel."
"Go on," urged Zoya, as the man paused.
"The Fräulein took the suitcase into the bathroom and in a moment brought it forth and handed it to me. It was very heavy, but that was none of my business." "What did you do with it?" "My instructions were to take it to the Hauptbahnhof and leave it in the check room, returning with the check which I was to give to her. provided I had an opportunity to hand it to her unobserved. So I told Herr Berghoff that I was taking a bag to the station, and carried it there." "Ah, you told Herr Berghoff that, and when you returned you gave her the ticket?" asked Roland excitedly. "There was no chance. When I returned to the hotel and went up the servants' stairs to the second floor, I heard a loud commotion in the corridor, and peering out, saw Herr Berghoff and another gentleman standing before the door of the Fräulein, knocking and shouting. Then I knew that it was best for me to remain silent. So I went to Herr Berghoff, reporting that I was sick, and went out of the hotel, and then I think that I drank more than was good for me, for I have slept until just now when you awakened me." "Did anyone come to your room while you slept?"
"How should I know? No one comes here."
"No one could have taken the ticket for the bag?" The man looked bewildered.
"I don't know."
"The ticket, the check for the bag,"
shouted Zoya, mad with excitement.
"It is here,"
he said, and fingering stupidly in his waistcoat pocket, Dreilich produced an oblong slip of cardboard.
"The Hauptbahnhof,"
cried Roland. "Come." And dragging the unfortunate Dreilich by the arm before he had a chance even to take up his cap, Roland turned toward where Herr Berghoff had stood beside the door. The man had disappeared. A blank look came into Roland's face, followed by a sudden frown, as he cursed himself for his stupidity in not keeping better watch. But there was no time to spare, and pushing Dreilich before him into the waiting cab, in a moment he and Zoya Rochal were driving post-haste to the railway station.
"Was the bag locked?"
asked Zoya eagerly.
"I don't know."
"We shall find it," muttered Roland between set teeth.
"Monsieur Roland,"
said Zoya, smiling at him joyously,
"you are quite the most wonderful man in all the world. Accept my congratulations."
"Wait," said Roland shortly. As they drove up to the station, Roland leaped out and, still holding Dreilich by the arm, hurried toward the parcel room, Zoya Rochal breathlessly following. At the window, his heart leaping with suspense, Roland presented the ticket to the baggage agent, who with maddening deliberation moved slowly along an aisle, whistling and peering to right and left. Zoya, her hand trembling on Roland's arm, watched the leisurely movements of the official, like Roland a prey to maddening incertitude. They saw the man go down the aisle, looking at bag after bag, finally picking out a bright yellow suitcase, bringing it forth and laying it upon the counter. Roland glanced at Dreilich, who was staring at the new bag stupidly, but compelled by Roland's gaze, he frowned and whispered,
"It is not the bag."
"It's not the bag," repeated Roland. "There's some mistake here." The official scratched his head and frowned. "That is strange. It is impossible that our checking system should err." "But it has erred," roared Roland. "It was this man himself who brought the bag here, this office which gave him the ticket. Is it not so?" to Dreilich.
"That is true. A black bag, old, plastered with labels."
"We never make mistakes," broke in the official with rising anger. "Our records show that this is your bag. You must take it." Roland could have laughed in the man's face, but instead he raised his voice again, while the fingers of Zoya Rochal closed upon his arm, and he realized that a crowd was gathering. "Will you let this man look and see if he can discover my property?" he asked more quietly.
"Verboten,"
said the official shortly, and turning on his heel walked back to the records of the system which could not err. There seemed to be nothing to do but take the yellow suitcase to the cab and depart. Somewhat bewildered by this ill turn of fortune, which could not be explained, Roland took up the bag dejectedly, and was about to lead the way to the door when he felt Zoya Rochal's fingers fiercely clutch his elbow. She stopped, her face blanching, her eyes staring wildly at a tall figure in a military uniform who stood before her. The man was very erect and quite old, his face graven with innumerable fine wrinkles which just now had broken into a cynical smile.
"My compliments, madame," said a thin, crisp voice. "It is a great pleasure to meet you here, so unexpectedly."
Zoya Rochal had recovered herself instantly and forced a laugh.
"You, Herr General, it is a great pleasure."
"You grow more beautiful, madame, with every year. A little pale, perhaps, but it becomes you, like the blossoms upon a meadow in June. You are quite well?"
"Ah, quite, Herr General."
"It seemed to me that perhaps you were a little nervous."
"It is so long since I have seen you. I thought perhaps that you might be angry at my failure last year."
"Angry? I? One cannot expect to succeed always."
And then with a malicious grin,
"You are not engaged in any propaganda dangerous to the fatherland."
"Ah, you are unkind. Have I not?"
"Women are the only uncertain quantity in the world equation,"
he said slowly, his eyes peering down at her. Then turning to Roland, he asked quickly,
"Your companion is harmless?"
Roland, who had stood uneasily, bag in hand, now found refuge in a smile.
"Harmless? Yes,"
stammered Zoya.
"Herr Leo Knaus, Herr General Graf——"
"No names, madame,"
broke in the tall officer with a smile.
"Goodbye, and remember that Argus had 100 eyes."
And with one keen look which seemed to sweep them both comprehendingly from top to toe, the Herr General clicked his heels and departed. Zoya Rochal remained as though frozen to the floor, looking after him. Roland caught her by the arm and moved slowly toward the door. "Sardonic old pelican," he said with a grin. "Would you mind telling me who in the devil——"
"The devil himself,"
she broke in with a stifled voice.
"Graf von Stromberg."
End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of The Golden Bough by George Gibbs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, recording by Tony Oliva. The clue. The shock of Madame Rochal's announcement took Roland's breath away. If they had needed any explanation of the disappearance of the black bag, here surely was one which would have satisfied the most exacting. Von Stromberg, head of the Prussian Secret Service, the most hated, the most feared man in all Europe. The jig was up. Roland shrugged, making up his mind to bluff it out to the end, and so, with his hand on Zoya's nerveless arm, walked with an appearance of great carelessness toward the door of the station, beyond which their cab was awaiting them. An official stood near the door, and a soldier nearby, but when Roland reached the man, he merely preened at his mustache and smiled at Zoya. They reached the door. Still no arrest. The thing was interesting. What was the game? In the doorway Roland stopped, put down the bag, and in spite of the whispers of Zoya Rochal, deliberately faced the door while he lighted a cigarette. The official had turned his back. The soldier had walked away. He was frankly puzzled. It hadn't needed a great deal of imagination on Roland's part to convince him that if Herr General von Stromberg had been instrumental in the theft of the bag, there was very little time left to Roland in which to say his prayers. By all the rules of the game, he should already have been arrested. Inside of 20 minutes he should be in a prison, and tomorrow morning he should be shot. But here he was, free, carrying the odious yellow suitcase and getting into a cab under the very eyes of the very person who had most to lose by his liberty. Had efficiency slipped a cog, or was there a motive behind this astonishing leniency? Or, still more surprising, was von Stromberg as innocent as he and Zoya as to the whereabouts of the bag of the Bayerischer Hof? Indeed, he was almost ready to believe so. He turned again to the door of the cab and slowly gave directions to drive to the house of Georg Senf. And then, while the pallid Zoya beseeched him frantically to hurry, he got into the cab and sank beside her. If von Stromberg was the man who had found the money, why, with all the authority he possessed, had he not arrested Dreilich, Berghoff, Liedermann, Zoya Rochal, and Roland, put them in prison, and discussed the matter afterwards? What was the meaning of this extraordinary consideration? Was it due to the nature of the business at hand, a desire to keep secret the dark business of the theft of the funds of Nemi, which would antagonize the small army of socialists in Munich, who were growing in power in the message they were sending across the breadth of the nation? Or was von Stromberg waiting until all the cards should be in his own hand, when he would play them to win? Indeed, if the millions of banknotes were already in his possession, it seemed that von Stromberg had already won and could afford to laugh at Herr Senf and all his followers. And yet, if this man of mystery and power already knew so much, why had not Roland already been imprisoned as an alien enemy and a spy? To this mental question there were two answers. The first, the obvious one, that Gregory Hochwald had not believed that Roland, the escaped prisoner from a German camp, would dare to risk his life again, following the fortunes of Nemi into the heart of the enemy's country, and that von Stromberg had accepted this opinion. The second, that General von Stromberg had just descended from his train from Berlin and knew nothing about him. The first answer was plausible, but it didn't satisfy. The second satisfied, but it wasn't plausible. For the old demon had surely acted the omniscient with his keen eyes and sardonic smile, frightening poor Zoya half to death. And yet it was just possible. D the fellow! He couldn't know everything. Roland was plucking up his spirits admirably. At least he hadn't been arrested yet. Poor Zoya seemed for the moment bereft of all spirit and initiative, and leaned back in the cab, frowning out of the window, her arms folded, a very thundercloud of vexation. "We have lost," she said at last in despair. "It seems so," said Roland with a smile, lighting another cigarette. "And yet there remain several matters which I do not understand." "That man! There will be much more that you do not understand, if you have to deal with him. He is uncanny, in league with the devil himself." "Perhaps. I can well believe it." As the thought came to him, Roland glanced suddenly over his shoulder out of the rear window. "Ah, I thought so. It's not von Stromberg, Zoya. It's Hochwald. We are being followed. 2 men on bicycles." She was too well trained to look around, but seemed no happier because of the discovery. "There's no use losing one's nerve," said Roland cheerfully. "In fact, I'm growing happier every minute." Madame Rochal's amazement was painted in her face. He shrugged. "Because if General von Stromberg had succeeded in getting the money, he would have arrested us both at the Hauptbahnhof." "You mean that——" "That someone else has taken it." "Precisely." "Hochwald?" "Perhaps. I don't know. But as we say in my country, I'm from Missouri." you've got to show me. And if Herr Senf is the man I think he is, I'm going to proceed on that theory." The workings of Philip Rowland's brain, it seemed, had been a mystery to her from the first, when she had thought him such easy fish for her net, and she looked at him now with a new interest, as though some more brilliant facet of his personality had suddenly been revealed to her. She threw her hands impulsively over his own and drew closer to him. "You, at least, mon brave, are a man," she said. "Listen, Zoya," he put in quickly. "This is no time for fooling. It's going to be a squad and a stone wall for me if things don't break right. You've got to do what I tell you. I've got a lot to do between now and night, and I can work better alone. I'm going to give those blighters back there the slip. You're going to go to the Russischer Hof, take the yellow bag and wait. Understand?" She nodded, pressed his hand, sighed, and sank back in her seat. He leaned forward, gave some orders to the driver, and then, as they turned a corner where the traffic was thick, he opened the door quickly, jumped out, and lost himself in the throng upon the sidewalk. As the cab went up the street, he had the satisfaction of seeing the men upon bicycles pass him by in their vain quest, and with a smile turned the nearby corner and hurried in the direction of the house of Georg Senf, which was upon the other side of the river. "D the woman," Rowland was muttering. "I've got other business." What mattered the millions of Nemi if he couldn't find Tanya? He shut his lips and increased his stride, tortured by the maddening uncertainty as to her whereabouts. A serious matter, Hochwald had called it. It would prove a serious matter for him if they ever met on anything like equal terms. And yet, if it was von Stromberg who was opposed to him, what was the chance of his finding Tanya in this city of more than 500,000 people? But if Nemi meant anything, there was a power here that might be more than a match for this subtle Prussian general. What was he here for, unless to seize the millions of Nemi? But he hadn't seized them yet. Rowland's immunity from arrest was the pledge of it. Then who had them? Who had taken the black bag? Was Hochwald playing some deep game of his own in defiance of the dangerous Prussian? And if he had taken the black bag, why had he ordered these men to follow his cab instead of arresting him at once? Rowland had now reached the point of believing that Hochwald didn't know where the black bag was. This new hope was based on other premises than his inherent optimism. There were several missing links in the stories of Drelich and Herr Berghof. Each by itself was clear, but taken together there was food for thought. He hadn't liked Herr Berghof. The fellow had a shifting eye. He had come to testify because not to do so would have made him an object of suspicion. Rowland had watched him closely and had noted the growing hesitancy in his manner as the American had probed deeper into the problem. Why had he suddenly fled? Did he know that there would be no money in the bag to be redeemed at the Hauptbahnhof? In this case he was an agent of Gregory Hochwald or Baron von Stromberg. Or had he fled because he thought that there would be no bag to redeem? And why, if an agent of Hochwald, should he show such inquietude? And why, on the other hand, disappear suddenly on the eve of a recovery which would redound much to his credit, with a probability of substantial reward? Berghof hadn't rung true somehow. As he strode rapidly over the bridge, dismissing the elusive bag and thinking of Tanya, he made a resolve to put the authority of Nemi to the test. He had taken this greatness because it had been thrust upon him, in a spirit half of amusement, half of adventure, because Tanya had demanded it of him. But the joke seemed to be on him now. These Bavarians were serious, sober, and deeply in earnest. And if the verboten signs didn't frighten them before they started something, there was a promise of big doings in Munich before many hours passed.
He was it, the Grand Mogul, and great things were expected of him. He would try not to disappoint them. If he didn't find Tanya and the money, it wouldn't be long before the prettiest little revolution this prince-ridden country had ever seen would be brewing right here, where brewing was the leading industry. He would brew them one, and if it ever got properly started, it would reach to Potsdam. At the house of the socialist leader, Roland gained a new sense of his power. For during his absence, the heads of many of the different labor organizations of Munich had called to offer him their fealty and encouragement. And to focus his attention quite definitely upon the meeting tonight, Senf showed him a message that had been received from Herr Hochwald a moment before his arrival, announcing that gentleman's intention to be present with the Central Committee, at which he expected to bring up matters of grave importance. "They're going to test our strength," said Senf quite calmly, "and we're going to let them. It will be a fight for our existence." "If they'll only forget the verboten signs," said Roland absently, for he was thinking of Tanya. "I beg pardon?" asked Senf politely. "I was thinking of another matter. How shall you succeed against Hochwald while he holds your most important witness? They will believe that Fräulein Korasoff has taken this money unless she is there to accuse her jailer. I must find her, Herr Senf, and you must help me before tonight." "Ah," said Senf, with a sudden access of interest, and told Roland of a report that had come to him a short while before. The cabman who had driven the Fräulein and Herr Hochwald away from the Bayerischer Hof had with some difficulty been found. He had driven them to the garage of the Bureau of State Railroads, and the pair had departed in an automobile. The official at the garage, evidently acting under instructions, refused to talk, but Senf's agent had been lucky, for a mechanician in the garage was a political follower of Max Liedermann's and a member of the Order of Nemi, and had heard quite accidentally that the automobile had gone to a villa upon the banks of the Lake of Starnberg. Roland's eyes kindled. It was high time that fortune aided him. Starnberg, he found, was less than 20 miles away, and could be reached by railroad in 3/4 of an hour. He sent for and questioned the man who had brought the information, but could elicit nothing more, for the mechanician had told all that he knew, and there was no way of finding the precise location of the villa without arousing the suspicion of the official, and this might be fatal to any plans to effect a search. When the man had gone, Roland looked at the clock on the mantel. It was 4 o'clock. "Herr Senf," he said with a smile, "you have done wonders. I could not have asked more of you. I must move now in search of the Fräulein, and move quickly. I'm going to Starnberg at once." "You? But Herr Roland, the committee, we meet tonight. I had counted upon you to speak to them." "I shall try to come back in time. I shall try," he muttered with a wave of his hand. "But you see how it is. Without her, we must do what we can." "Are there members of the Order of Nemi at Starnberg?" he asked quietly. "Yes, a few. Herr Benz. You must send a wire to him at once to expect me. I leave on the first train." 3/4 of an hour. "I will do as you say. But you will return?" "Yes." Senf wrote a message and gave it to a man who was waiting outside the door. "To Herr Weiss, in the code. A handkerchief, a red handkerchief, in his left hand. You understand?" The matter of a disguise was imperative, and in a few moments, in the blouse and cap of a workman, Roland stood in the door, shaking the old man by the hand. "One more thing, Herr Senf. Herr Berghoff must be found at once, and hidden until my return." "Herr Berghoff? He should come willingly enough." Roland smiled. "I'm afraid not. He has taken fright." "But why?"
I don't know. If he is honest, you should find him at the Bayerischer Hof. If he is merely frightened, the matter may be more difficult. But if he knows more than he has told us, he is already on his way to the Swiss border." "You suspect him?" "I suspect everyone. He says that he was asleep, but Drelich avers that he told Berghoff he had carried a suitcase to the Hauptbahnhof. Berghoff knew that, and he knew also what the suitcase contained. Money, much money." "True," cried Senf excitedly. "But how could he have redeemed the bag without the ticket in Drelich's pocket?" "He couldn't, but he could have gone to the lodgings of Drelich and taken it. The porter was drunk." "And the ticket Drelich gave you?" Roland grinned. "Would there not be other baggage checks in the office of the Bayerischer Hof? The owner of the bag may be hunting it now. Find the owner of that bag, Herr Senf, and we will know who made the substitution." "Donnerwetter!" cried Senf. "It is quite possible. But if we have learned this much, what is to have prevented Herr Hochwald from learning it also?" "Nothing, unless——" "Unless what, Herr Roland?" "Unless Herr Berghoff has managed to elude him." Senf scowled at the opposite wall. "We shall see about this. Go, Herr Roland. You may leave this matter quite safely in my hands. I will bring Herr Berghoff here and crush the truth from him with my bare hands." Roland laughed at the old man's enthusiasm. "Yes, but if you don't find him in Munich, a wire to Shestoff and Bartu might not be inadvisable." "You think?" "I think nothing," said Roland. "I'm tired of thinking. But I'm the best little guesser in Munich. And now I must be off." Sending Liedermann to Zoya Rochal and the Russischer Hof to search the yellow bag and, if possible, find its owner, Roland went at once to the Hauptbahnhof and took a train for Starnberg. He had no definite plan, but what he had already seen of George Senf's influence and following gave him new courage. If Tanya were still at the villa to which she had been taken, he would find some way to reach her. In the train, many plans came into his mind. He now knew that the man he was to meet here, and if necessary others who did his bidding, would be absolutely at his orders, and the sense of the power that he possessed made him bold. It might be difficult to find the villa to which Tanya had been taken, for Starnberg was a town of several thousand inhabitants. But the villas, he had been told, were strung along the wooded slopes of the lake, each in its spacious grounds, and Gustav Benz would know the names and occupants of all the regular summer residents. It would perhaps not be difficult, once he found where Tanya was, to approach the place with 5 or 6 men and accomplish by force what might be difficult alone. But there was a strong argument against a fight, which might bring in the police and end in publicity, if not disaster. The subtler plan appealed to him more. Hochwald could hardly suspect the good fortune that had enabled Roland to discover the whereabouts of the prisoner, and, if not aroused before Roland's plans matured, would probably permit some carelessness of Tanya's jailers, which would open the door to her escape. Roland meant to move slowly until he was sure of his opportunity, then acting quickly with such means as presented. It was 5:30 o'clock when he descended from the train, with an old bag of Senf's in his right hand, in the guise of a Munich workman off for a few days' holiday. In his left hand he carried a cheap red handkerchief, with which, as he reached the platform, he wiped his brow. He waited in a moment of apparent indecision when a man at the door of the station stepped forward. He had a handkerchief in his left hand. Roland stopped before him, and the man extended his hand. "You come from Herr Senf?" he asked. "From Senf, yes. You are Herr Benz?" "Yes," replied the other.
Come."
End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Golden Bough by George Gibbs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Oliva. The Turkish Cigarette. He was a prosperous-looking man, a small house owner, perhaps, or tradesman, but he had a broad brow and a look of alertness which were an earnest of his intelligence. Roland walked by his side, conversing easily of casual things, until they reached a street upon the edge of the town, built up with rows of smaller houses, all much alike, each in its well-kept yard. Into one of these houses Bent's led the way, and in a moment they were safe from curious eyes. Roland was quite certain that he had not been observed either upon the train or in the town, and it was therefore with a feeling of confidence as to his own present security that he informed Herr Bentz of the nature of his errand, and the necessity for immediate aid from those friends who had the interests of the Order of Nemi at heart. Herr Bentz made no pretense of concealing his antipathy for the Prussian government, and proclaimed his full allegiance to the socialist cause. The deference which he paid Roland and exacted of his son, a boy of 16, the supper served by the neat Frau, and the willingness Herr Bentz expressed to aid in any possible way, showed Roland how deep and strong was the undercurrent of antagonism and unrest in the hearts of the placid, easy-going Bavarians. Bentz knew Starnberg, he said, as he knew the palm of his hand. He had been born and bred here, and for 20 years had conducted the small bakery which was now his own. He knew every villa as far as Possenhofen, where Elizabeth, Empress of Austria, and Herr Roland must be aware, the daughter of Duke Max, was born. Every villa, he must think. All these people were good customers of his, and had been for years. His son every morning early delivered the bread, a distance of 2 miles or more to the furthest house. Did Herr Roland believe the villa he sought could be as far away as that? Roland shrugged helplessly. "I know nothing more than I have told you," he said. "A villa upon Starnberg See, near Starnberg. That is all I know." Bentz nodded, but his brow was puzzled. "Near? How near? A mile? Fortunately, all the villas that need be considered are on the east bank of the lake. That reduces our labors. I will try to remember them one by one." That task seemed to be hopeless, even with the aid of the boy, who was called in to testify. The day was now fading, and so Roland suggested that they go out and walk the length of the road, and attempt by a process of elimination to isolate those houses which might for any cause be classified as possibly open to suspicion. The suggestion was acceptable to Herr Bentz, and so he left word with his son that if any message came from Herr Senf over the telegraph, arrangements for which had already been made, Bentz the younger was to bring the message along the road on his bicycle and keep passing to and fro until he found them. They then set forth, smoking their cigars, very vile ones, which Herr Bentz had provided, and presently were walking down the well-ordered driveway along the shimmering lake. One by one Herr Bentz named the owners of the cottages, puzzling here and there over a doubtful case. Roland, with an appearance of great unconcern, eagerly searching the grounds with his glance, the lighted windows, for a glimpse of a feminine figure which might be Tanya's. The night was warm, and upon the terraces overlooking the water, many of the occupants of the houses were sitting enjoying the night air. He heard the low murmur of their voices, a light laugh here and there, the sound of a piano, and young people singing, but nothing that could give any immediate clue as to the location of the villa he sought. And yet Tanya Korasoff was here somewhere, near him, waiting for the aid that had not come. At the end of the driveway, which now became a mere country road, Herr Bentz paused, for the distance between the houses had grown greater, and except for a few small cottages in the dusk beyond, the region of larger places had come to an end. The total results of Herr Bentz's process of elimination to this point were 5 houses as follows: 2 small villas, the names of whose occupants were unknown; a large unoccupied house belonging to an Italian, Count Monteori, who because of the war had been absent for 3 years; the magnificent place of Baron von Speck, occupied only by the servants, its owner being on the staff of Prince Leopold in France; the chateau of Frau Baltazzi, an aged Grecian woman of wealth, who lived alone with a female companion. It was with some difficulty that the impatient Roland constrained himself to sit with Herr Bentz upon a rock overlooking the placid lake and calmly discuss the matter. "You are sure," he asked, "that you are quite familiar with the antecedents of the occupants of all the other houses?" "Quite, Herr Roland. In the case of additional persons coming into these houses, the orders for bread would undoubtedly be increased. My son is a clever boy. He would hear of any newcomers through the kitchen doors. With these larger houses the case is different. Frau Baltazzi is a woman of mystery. She has no friends in Starnberg, but she is very old and invalid. It is possible that Herr Hochwald may have the authority to compel her, but I doubt it, Herr Roland." Indeed, after a process of question and reply which seemed to be sufficiently conclusive, only the residences of Count Monteori and Baron von Speck remained as probabilities. Having reached this conclusion, it was decided for the present to concentrate all attention upon these 2 places, and so, turning north, they walked slowly back toward the town, while Bentz told what he further knew of the 2 residences under suspicion. The place of Baron von Speck was just before them on their right, a pretentious stone mansion in the midst of a grove of trees, beyond a spacious lawn at some distance from the road. Roland, who felt sure, because of the baron's rank and affiliations, that the use of this house by a representative of the Prussian Secret Service would be justified, was for entering the grounds at once and making a thorough investigation of the premises. Time was precious, and it was worth taking a chance, but Herr Bentz hesitated. Here again Roland discovered that awe of the military authority which he had noticed in Max Liedermann, a habit of thought bred in the bone since childhood, which for a moment of inaction seemed to have created a sudden atrophy in this man's interest and enthusiasm. But the moment passed, for Herr Bentz did not lack courage. "Wait here," he said at last. "I will go and inquire." So Roland concealed himself in a clump of shrubbery within the grounds while he watched the figure of Bentz go around the turn in the road toward the house until he was lost in the shadows. He had promised not to move, but every impulse urged him to follow and pursue the investigation in his own way, for he felt sure that the end of the chase was near. But he realized that Herr Bentz had reasons for his method of approach, and decided, at least for the present, to await in patience the result of his investigation. After a while he heard the footsteps of the man crunching the gravel of the driveway, and in a moment had joined him. Bentz was shaking his head. "I went to the kitchen and saw the housekeeper, telling her of the new order as to the slight increase this summer of the ration of war bread. She had not known of it, and was thankful for the information, but informed me that her own orders from the baron were strict, and that her household had been reduced to 3 persons, so that what she was allowed would be sufficient. Further conversation followed, and she took me to see the view of the lake from the terrace. There is no one there, Herr Roland, but the 3 servants. I would take my oath to it." Roland's hopes fell, and yet he realized that after all the decision of Herr Bentz had been a wise one. "Did you make any inquiries in regard to the villa of Count Monteori?" he asked. "Yes, and they know nothing." And so the two men went northward again more rapidly. The Monteori villa, like that of Baron von Speck, lay within spacious grounds well wooded. The house itself, built of stone and stucco like many of those famous residences on the lakes of Italy, just upon the edge of the lake, the waters of which lapped the base of the stone wall which protected its terrace and garden. As Bentz had said, it had long been unoccupied except for 2 servants, and if the Prussian government had seen fit to use it for purposes of its own, the fact could, he thought, be quite easily discovered. But the method of approach which had been so successful in the case of the house of Baron von Speck might be hazardous here, since Herr Bentz was not upon terms with the caretaker Taglitz, a North German, an old man of a violent temper who suffered much from asthma. Last year Bentz had quarreled with him about the payment of a bill, and so it was decided that he and Roland should separate before they reached the place, moving with caution under the protection of whatever cover availed in a quiet investigation of the lighted windows and garden. Roland chose the side toward the lake, and leaving the road where the shadows of the trees afforded protection, moved down through the underbrush cautiously, peering forward, waiting and listening, and then making a long detour to avoid a stretch of lawn until he reached a small ravine, down which a stream trickled to the lake below. Progress was slow because of the necessity for caution, but at last he emerged near the edge of the lake, and hidden behind a huge rock, gazed upward toward the windows of the house less than 200 feet away. He saw that a wall of stone separated the terrace from the lawns. There was a gate in the wall, probably locked, so that it seemed as though the best mode of approach would be from the lake itself to the stairs which led up to the terrace. There was a light in one window of the house, upon the second floor under the tiled roof, another, a dim one, in the room which led out upon the terrace, and he thought that he could distinguish the low murmur of voices above the lapping of the waters of the lake beside him. But he was not sure. There was no way of getting nearer the house from this side without a danger of being observed, for the moon had risen and there was no cover on the lawn before him. And so he lay quiet for a while, keeping watch on the windows. While he looked, he fancied he heard voices again from the window upstairs, and then shortly afterward a new light appeared in the wing of the house, a candle or lamp which threw a large shadow upon the wall. For 20 minutes he watched it, and then he heard the sound of a door closing, and at the same moment the light went out. Whoever had gone to that room had left it, taking the light with him. He fancied now that he heard the sound of a masculine voice, and then a figure appeared upon the terrace, threw a cigarette over the wall into the lake, and then went indoors. But a cloud had come over the face of the moon, and it was not possible to distinguish the identity or appearance of the smoker. But presently upon the light breeze was wafted the odor of a Turkish cigarette. After a while the light on the lower floor went out, and so Roland slowly retraced his steps up the ravine to the road, determined to choose another point of observation. He lighted his pipe, and passing the gates to the park, went on to the farthest boundary, the appointed spot at which he and Herr Bentz had decided to meet and compare notes. Herr Bentz had heard nothing, seen nothing suspicious, but when Roland informed him as to the man with the Turkish cigarette, Bentz listened attentively. "You are quite sure that it was a Turkish cigarette?" he asked. "Quite positive." "That is curious." "Why?" "Because in Munich one smokes a pipe or a cigar. The cigarettes one may buy are too expensive for such a man as Taglitz, this caretaker, to smoke." This seemed a slender straw to clutch at, But as Roland thought of it, the smell of the Turkish cigarette seemed to grow in significance. Taglitz, an old man who suffered from asthma, would hardly choose a Turkish cigarette, even if he dared to smoke at all, and the only other occupant of the house was his daughter, who cooked his meals and looked after him. Either Fräulein Taglitz had formed a very bad habit, or Herr Taglitz had visitors, and so they walked a short way down the road toward the town while they planned. Herr Bentz wanted to go to town and bring 2 of his followers, one of whom could watch the driveway, the other to hide near the house while Roland found a means of entrance by the terrace from a boat on the lake. To this Roland agreed, insisting, however, that he should remain watching the house in the meanwhile. They had just bidden each other farewell, and Roland had turned back toward the suspected villa when he heard the sound of voices behind him and stopped to listen, returning quickly to the group. Herr Bentz introduced him quickly to a man young Bentz had brought with him. "This is the government telegraph officer at Starnberg station, but a friend, Herr Roland. He brings you a message from Georg Senf." "A message? I know nothing of this matter," said the man in uniform. "The message was in cipher. It is this: Herr Berghof was murdered this afternoon. No clues, no trace of bag. Berghof murdered." Roland questioned the man eagerly. "At what time did this message arrive?" "Less than half an hour ago." "It came by private code?" "Yes, from Herr Weiss." "I see. I owe you many thanks." "I would do more if I could, but I must return at once." "Go then. You will be on duty later?" "Until morning, Herr Roland." "Good. I may have a message to send." The man bowed and departed with the younger Bentz, while Roland watched them in silence until their figures were merged into the night. Berghof murdered! By whom and why? The answers to these questions were obvious if he chose to follow the train of thought that was uppermost in his mind. Had Hochwald killed him, or Förster, or another agent of von Stromberg? The motive one of 2 things: to secure the black bag filled with the banknotes which Berghof had taken, or to silence a tongue which had already spoken too much, or perhaps both. Whatever the facts, the death of the man with the squint was eloquent of the fact that Roland had not been far wrong in his deductions. Herr Berghof had paid the penalty, either of cupidity or disloyalty to those who employed him. In any event, it was clear that if the black bag had ever been in his possession, it had now passed to a confederate, or to Gregory Hochwald, and therefore if... A warning sound from Herr Bentz brought his speculations to a close, for from within the grounds they had just left came the sound of an approaching motor car. "It must have been hidden in the porte cochère," Bentz was muttering. "I did not see it." As the machine approached, they walked toward it, and it passed them at a rapid rate, going in the direction of the village. Just one glimpse they had of the occupants, a chauffeur and a man wearing a cap, sitting in the shadow of the curtains in the tonneau and smoking a cigarette. Who was he? It was impossible to tell, but to Roland's keen eyes the figure seemed strangely like that of Herr Hochwald. Imagination? Perhaps. Roland's interest in the Villa Monteori was now such that he was ready to think anything that would confirm his growing belief that here was the prison of Tanya Korasoff. Herr Bentz, too, shared his excitement. Herr Hochwald hurrying to the committee meeting he had called. The thing hung together. There were few enough motor cars in the Empire, and all those not in use by officials of Munich had been put into requisition for military purposes. There was but one machine at Starnberg, an ancient affair which could only be hired at a price beyond the means of any but the most wealthy of the town. He had seen a machine this afternoon rapidly passing his bakery, which was on the highway to Munich. Was it this very machine? It had a top like this, a chauffeur and one man set within. He had commented upon its passage to his boy. The young fellow who shared the mystery of their search now voluntarily cleared their minds of doubt, for with that omniscience in all things which pertain to makes of cars, he ventured in a guarded tone: "It is the very machine which came from Munich this afternoon." "How do you know?" asked Roland eagerly. "It's a Mercedes, sir," he said. "I know it by the shape of the hood." If a machine went back and forth between the Villa Monteori and the city of Munich, it was doubtless because of urgent affairs in which some official empowered to use automobiles was involved. Who but Hochwald? And what affairs, unless those of Tanya and the black bag of the Bayerischer Hof? Roland had reached the point where he felt that he must leap at a conclusion of some sort. At any rate, there were 2 men the less at the Villa Monteori, and it was time to risk everything in an effort to bring this adventure to a conclusion, whether in failure or success. Roland planned rapidly. A short distance below them there was a crossroad which led down to the lake, at the foot of which, in the dusk of the evening, he had noticed a small pier or jetty, near which a number of canoes, sailboats, and rowboats were moored. He proposed to take one of these boats, and under cover of the darkness rowed down in the shadow of the bank to the stone steps of the villa, which led from the terrace wall to the water. As the sky had now become cloudy and the night quite dark, it would thus be possible to come unnoticed much nearer to the house than if he attempted to enter by the road or to cross the lawns where the stone wall must be climbed. Herr Bentz would wait in the pavilion, which seemed to be deserted. If Roland did not return before 10 o'clock, he was to take another rowboat with the other 2 men whom young Bentz had gone to fetch from Starnberg, and follow. Bentz demurred at first, professing a desire to share his dangers, but at last consented to the arrangement, and Roland embarked and set off upon his solitary venture. As it was early, there were many young people out on the lake in canoes and sailboats returning to shore, and the sounds of their voices came softly across the water. Their presence in the neighborhood was reassuring and likely to distract the attention of any visitors at the Villa Monteori. Roland slipped slowly down under the very shadow of the terrace wall, where his boat drifted in close to the steps, where Roland listened for a long moment, and then fastened the painter to a ring in the wall and disembarked. He had determined to enter this house and search it from top to bottom, regardless of consequences. A fool's errand? Perhaps, for he had little evidence to confirm his theory, which after all had been born more of hope and desperation than any proof. And yet the chance was worth taking, for at the best it meant merely a discussion with an irascible and asthmatic watchman. At the worst, perhaps, an encounter with a government official who had a private commission with which he could have no concern. And this meant a rapid retreat and the saving of his skin. But the death of Berghof and the passage of the mysterious automobile from what was reported to be an untenanted house had seemed to point him a way which he couldn't ignore. If Tanya were here, the element of surprise would be in his favor, and as his head reached the level of the top of the steps, where he paused for a long moment of inspection of the house, he saw no indication of watchfulness on the part of those within. There were a rustic table and a number of benches and chairs upon the terrace, and crawling upon his hands and knees he hid himself behind a bench, where he could examine the lower floor of the house at closer quarters. There was a loggia enclosed in glass just before him. Within, in the main body of the house, a light was burning. At some risk of detection from the windows above, he moved closer and quickly rising, turned the knob of the glass door. To his surprise it yielded, and without hesitation he entered, closing it softly behind him. "Careless beggars, to forget there was a lake," he muttered. Roland's spirits were fast rising, and his fingers were itching for a grip on something tangible, preferably the Adam's apple of Codkina Hochwald. Denied that, anyone else's would do. But a disappointment awaited him here, for the door to the main body of the house was locked. He drew aside into the shelter of the wall and rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Not so dull after all," he said to himself. "But I'll make it, if it takes the butt of an automatic." Fortunately, he was not obliged to resort to that extremity, for a French window with a loose catch rewarded his patience. "It's flat burglary, nothing less," he said with a grin as he crossed the sill and entered the room. It was quite dark here, the only illumination coming from a lamp in an inner room, and he paused a moment to get his bearings and listened. A sound of voices somewhere upstairs. His breath came a little more quickly, the deep bass of a man, and he was sure the tones of a feminine reply. Taglitz and his daughter? He would soon find out. It took him a few moments of noiseless investigation to study the plan of the lower floor, the location of the steps which led upstairs, and the hall which led to the rear of the house. Then he peered into the lighted room beyond. It was empty, and upon the table lay what remained of a meal, the dishes of which had not yet been cleared away. At the further end of the room was a swinging door which led to the kitchen, and Roland crossed to it, in accordance with a quickly formulated plan to make safe the lower floor before he went upstairs. But just as he was about to go forward, there were sounds of heavy footsteps in the kitchen passage just beyond, and he had barely time to flatten himself against the wall when the door was pushed open and a man entered and walked to the table. He was an old man with bent shoulders, possibly a little deaf, and his breath wheezed like that of a horse with the heaves. It seemed a shame to do it, but there was no time for moral compunctions, and stepping quickly behind him, Roland thrust an arm around the fellow's neck, and with a knee in the small of his back, garroted him noiselessly and effectually. Then he laid the man upon the floor, and with a warning hand on his throat, which he threatened to tighten at the least indication of an outcry, questioned in tense whispers. "Herr Hochwald left this house half an hour ago." There was no reply, but a terrible gasp as Taglitz fought for his breath. "Answer me," growled Roland with an air of ferocity he was far from feeling. "Answer me, or I'll choke." Taglitz raised a feeble hand and tried to move his head, gasping horribly meanwhile. So Roland waited an anxious moment, fearing that the fellow would die, then questioned again. "Where has Herr Hochwald gone?" Taglitz shook his head. I don't know," he gasped. Roland could have shouted for joy. "Hochwald! Where is your daughter?" "Gone out since supper to visit in Starnberg." "Who are upstairs?" The eyes of Taglitz stared, and beneath him Roland could feel the man's limbs trembling in terror, but he wouldn't reply, so Roland's fingers closed gently upon his throat. "Answer me," he whispered, "or I'll choke you." Already Taglitz's eyes were starting from his head, and Roland released the pressure. "Answer," he said sternly. Taglitz gasped for a few moments of fearful unhappiness, then, as Roland's fingers tightened, held up a feeble hand. "Who are upstairs?" repeated Roland. Herr Förster." "Who else?" "Fräulein Korasow." "At what time did Herr Hochwald reach here?" "Before supper." "How long before supper?" Taglitz paused, and Roland's hand moved toward him. "An hour," he answered. Roland's brain was now acting quickly. "What did he do with the black bag he brought?" I don't know." Roland's eyes sparkled. "Did he carry it upstairs?" The terror in the man's eyes was pitiful, and the trembling began anew. But Roland was merciless.
Answer me." Again the hand threatened. "Don't strangle me. I will tell." And as Roland released him, "He took it to his room." "Where is his room?" The room from which Roland had been watching when he lay below the rock an hour ago. The shadow had been Hochwald's. Roland grinned at the frightened face beneath him while he reached for a napkin upon the table. "You're a brick, Herr Taglitz," he muttered in English. "That's what you are, a brick. But bricks are silent and harmless, unless in riotous hands." "What are you?" croaked the prisoner. The words were stifled by the napkin which Roland thrust into his mouth. It was a large napkin, and the ends tied firmly at the neck and chin made a neat gag. The two other napkins, one around his knees, the other at his elbows behind him, completed Roland's purpose, which was to render 160 pounds of potential Prussianism as helpless as Rameses II. He rolled Taglitz under the table, assuring himself that the man was in no danger of death, then searched the lower floor for signs of other occupants. But the man had spoken the truth, for there was no one else upon the lower floor. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of The Golden Bough by George Gibbs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, recording by Tony Oliva. Rescue. With a heart beating high, Roland paused at the bottom of the flight of stairs to listen. A man's laugh, Herr Förster's, and in the room with him, Tanya. This task was to be more difficult, and Roland felt rather pleased that it was to be so, for the impotent old man underneath the dining room table was already weighing on his conscience. Up the stairs he climbed, but he drew his automatic now, for no matter what happened he was going to reduce the chances of failure to a minimum. Again Förster's voice, and Tanya's in reply. As his eyes reached the level of the floor he saw the line of light beneath a door upon his left, and climbed quickly, approaching the door silently upon tiptoe. Here he stopped to listen again for a moment while he planned what to do. If the door was locked, he would perhaps have to find some other way to get in. Another door from an adjoining room. But Förster's voice now came to him clearly.
"The Fräulein is unkind. Is it my fault that I am set to guard you? I am only doing my duty."
Then Tanya's voice, a voice he recognized instantly, subdued but angry. "Your duty may be performed outside. I have no means of escape."
"My orders are strict, Fräulein. Until the return of Herr Hochwald, I was not to let you out of my sight, which is gladdened by your beauty. Why so unkind? I must obey."
"I pray you to leave me," came her voice wearily. "I am very tired."
"I am sorry. I pray you lie upon the divan, while, with your permission, I will smoke a cigarette at the window. No? Then I will sit and again feast my side upon your loveliness."
"You are a beast," said Tanya. Roland turned the knob furiously. The door yielded to his foot and flew open with a crash. He sought and found Förster's eyes covering him with his weapon. The surprise was complete. The man's hands went up above his head as his startled glance searched the obscurity of the doorway behind Roland, as though expecting others. Then, seeing no one, his right hand went down to his pocket.
"Hände hoch!"
Roland roared the warning, then fired as Förster's weapon came into line, fired quickly, once, twice, 3 times. He felt the cap twitched around on his head, but saw Förster's weapon falter and the bullet crash into the mirror beside him. As the man reeled and then toppled sideways upon the couch, rolling over and down upon the floor, where he lay motionless. Roland then turned toward the girl, who had risen from her chair and now stood clinging to the table, looking at him wide-eyed. She was very white, and her lips moved but made no sound. And then he realized that the clothing he wore had effectively disguised him, so he took off his cap and smiled at her cheerfully enough. He saw the recognition spread upon her face as she came forward, both arms extended.
"You, Monsieur Roland," she whispered in French.
"Tanya." Their fingers touched, their hands, and then a stronger impulse urged as he saw the look in the eyes turned up to his. She faltered a moment, but he caught her close to him and held her there. If this was the sanctuary she had awaited, she had surely found it. "Tanya," he was whispering, "I found you. Won't you tell me that you are glad?" She moved a little in his arms, but he only held her closer.
"Glad? Yes, Monsieur Roland, I'm glad," she murmured. "But at first I could not believe."
"What does it matter, so long as I found you? Your heart, Tanya? Have I found that too?" She made no sound, but her head sank a little lower on his breast. The tip of one ear only was visible in the confusion of her ruddy hair. He kissed it. "Answer me, Tanya," he insisted. "Your heart. It's that I've come for. Will you give it to me?" He felt her fingers press his own, felt her slender figure relax in his arms as she raised her head, while her grave eyes met his in one luminous moment and then were hidden by the long lashes under which two small tears trembled and fell. Illustration: her grave eyes met his in one luminous moment.
"My heart,"
he heard her whisper. "That is yours also, Monsieur Roland." Then he kissed her lips. "Philippe," he corrected gently. And with a smile she repeated, "Philippe." "Had you thought that I would come for you?" I didn't know what to think. It seemed impossible that you would dare venture into Germany. I had no hope of anyone else. I have been so frightened for you, so guilty in my conscience." "Why?" "Because it was I who brought you into all this trouble. The vault, the horror of it. Picard reached Shestov in time?" Roland laughed, kissed her again, and told her what had happened.
"Thank God. I have prayed the Holy Virgin for your safety," she murmured happily.
"I'm hard to get rid of. I've come back to stay, Tanya, for better or for worse." Her fingers pressed his.
"Whatever happens," she whispered, "for better or for worse."
"You love me," he whispered. "Tell me that you do." She smiled up at him.
"It would be strange if I do not, since I am here in your arms. But I am still frightened, Monsieur
Philippe."
"I am still frightened. You are not hurt?"
"No," he laughed. "I bear a charmed life. It is you who have kept me safe."
"I?"
"The Princess Tatiana, the fairy princess of my childhood, who has come to me again." He raised her chin and held her close. "Kiss me again," he whispered, "and make me immortal." She obeyed, and in the brief moment that they snatched from the whirl of danger, lost the world in each other. The moment passed, and it was Roland who first straightened, aware of the hazard of their position and of the man upon the floor who groaned and stirred. Roland bent over him and felt his heart, while Tanya, the fleeting color gone from her cheeks again, stood watching.
"Is he?"
"Thank God, no," said Roland, coolly putting Herr Förster's automatic into his own pocket. "But I'll take no chances. He may come around, all right, and begin shooting, and I mightn't be so lucky next time." He rose and caught Tanya by the hand as the urgency of his mission took precedence. "Listen, Tanya dear, we can't think of him. It was my death or his, and I couldn't take a chance. It's war, and it's not pretty. But we can't afford any sentiment now. We haven't a moment to spare. We must move quickly. The meeting of the Central Committee of Bavaria is set for tonight, and I have promised to return. It is gravely important. Hochwald is to be there. He is gone already. I saw him leave in a machine. He is going to play a desperate game, and I've just found out what it is. He has recovered the black bag in which you sent the money to the Hauptbahnhof. It is here, somewhere in this house." "Here? How do you know?" "I've found out. He brought it here. I suspect that he and the gentleman yonder upon the floor had planned to make away with it to Holland at the first opportunity." "I can't believe——" "Everything points to it. He told you that he was going to bring the case up in the committee, take the disposition of the funds of Nemi out of our hands, and have its appropriation made by the Munich committee itself. Is this not true?" "Yes, but how did you——" Roland grinned in self-gratulation. He was really beginning to have a high opinion of his own intelligence. "Madame Rochal told me. But if Hochwald had that notion, he has changed it now. He is going to that meeting tonight to swear that he has not been able to recover the money, that you have escaped from Germany and taken it with you." She was trying to understand. "And that is why he was guarding me so closely, so that I could not get in touch with our friends in Munich." "Precisely. Only you and I can save the situation. You who have only to tell the truth. I who will bring into the meeting the suitcase, and if I'm not guessing badly, show the banknotes themselves. Do you understand?" Tanya pressed his hand in token of comprehension. "But how do you know all this?" she asked. "I can't explain. There isn't time. Förster may come to at any moment and set up a howl. We must search the house. Will you help?" The rapidity of his extraordinary revelations had bewildered her a little, but with a shudder of horror at the man upon the floor, she followed Roland out into the hall, and with an effort gathered her scattered wits together. "You would know the bag if you saw it?" he asked. "The black bag of the Bayerischer Hof?" "Of course." "It should be in this room, in the wing on the south side," he muttered. And while she wondered at the completeness of his information, she showed him the way down the corridor into the room which Herr Hochwald had occupied. Together they searched it. In vain. The bag was not there. A methodical search of the house would take time, but there seemed nothing left to do. So Tanya lighted a candle to hunt in the other rooms upon the second floor, while Roland went down the stairs. "The caretaker, Taglitz!" she cried suddenly in alarm. Roland grinned. "Don't worry. He's doing his bit under the dining room table." She was not yet accustomed to the strange figures of speech of this astounding person to whom she had given her heart. She only knew that she believed in him with all her soul, and that if he could be cheerful, all was well. So she searched the rooms across the corridor, finding no bag of any sort. But in a moment she heard a cry from Roland and went to the head of the stairs, peering over, candle in hand. "I've found it," he cried. "Is not this it?" And as she came running down the stairs, she identified the black bag at once as the one the porter of the Bayerischer Hof had procured for her. "Clever," muttered Roland. "The perfect security of the obvious. Edgar Allan Poe stuff. Hasn't even bothered to hide it. See? It's heavy, not even touched. We've got to be off. Get your hat and coat. Our yacht awaits us at the foot of the steps." He was in high good humor. "Yacht?" "I came by the lake in a rowboat. Sorry I haven't a machine, but we must get back to Munich at once." She hurried up the stair for her bag, coat and hat, and in a moment had joined him by the window through which he had entered. He helped her over the sill, exacting a tribute as she passed, and then led her down the steps from the terrace and safely installed her in the stern of his stolen craft, in which they were soon pulling away from the shore. The hands of the clock in the hall of the house had pointed to 10. Altogether, he had been in the Villa Monteori less than an hour. If they hurried, there would still be time to make the evening train to Munich. A few drops of rain fell as they descended from the terrace, and in the distance from the heights of the Wetterstein there was a deep bass rumble of thunder. Roland bent to his oars and rowed along the shore, smiling at the girl who sat opposite him, a little bewildered at the rapidity of events, the swift tumultuous wooing, so soon ended, for she knew not what new hazards. But she could not misconstrue the marks of his preoccupation, and in reply to his breathless, eager questions, she told him of her fear that Hochwald would discover the papers containing his dossier and other incriminating data, which she had kept concealed in her shirt-waist, but she brought them out to his delight and showed them to him. He was eager, too, to learn how she had managed to hoodwink him in getting possession of the banknotes, and while he listened, she told him how she had accomplished the exchange, loading the suitcase which had contained the treasure with rocks taken from the road. As she finished, he suddenly stopped rowing and bent quickly forward over the bag which lay between them. "What is it, Philippe?" she asked anxiously. "A key to the bag," he cried. "It must be opened." "A key? Why, I have it. In my coat, I think. Here." And after a moment she handed it to him. Roland unlocked and tore open the bag and thrust a hand inside, a terrible expression of dismay upon his face, the first she had ever seen there, or perhaps would see again. "Glad I thought of it," he muttered. "It seemed too easy. Rocks, stones, it's filled with rubbish." And taking out a stone, he dropped it with a loud splash into the water. "I must go back," he muttered, taking up his oars in a moment of indecision. "I must go back." But instead of doing so at once, he pulled furiously for the pavilion, where he found the patient Bentz waiting for him. "Success," he explained. "Fräulein Korasoff is here. But the money——" "He has removed it?" "No. It's in that house. I would take my oath." He broke off hurriedly and got out, helping Tanya to the jetty. "Herr Bentz, in a way we are very fortunate. It is very necessary that Fräulein Korasoff be taken at once in safe hands to the meeting of the committee. There is a train, you say, at 10:30? She must go on it. Are there 2 men whom you can trust?" "They are here," said Bentz with a smile. "We were just on the point of following you to Monteori Villa." "Ah, good. Then let them take Fräulein Korasoff to Munich. Tanya, these men are your friends and the friends of the cause. You are quite safe with them. Listen attentively and obey these instructions. You will send a wire to George Senf telling of your safety and departure for Munich. The telegraph officer knows and is to be trusted. Senf will have men to meet you at the Hauptbahnhof. Do you understand?" "Yes," she murmured. "Then au revoir. I will join you later." "You are going?" Tanya asked anxiously. "Back there," he muttered grimly. In the darkness he saw the compression of her lips, but he stepped into the boat, and in a moment all that remained of Tanya was the remembrance of the swift brave touch of her fingers upon his own. Herr Bentz remained at the pavilion to resume his watch of suspense and inaction, but he obeyed orders, aware that the tremendous import of the business in which they were involved had given him a new sense of importance in the great cause. 25 millions of francs. That was enough to spread the gospel throughout all the world. Roland lost no time in covering the distance to the villa, for caution was now of less importance than time, and in a short while he was crawling in through the French window into the hall. First he examined the bonds of Taglitz, and then went quickly up the stairs to the room where Förster lay. The man had recovered consciousness, but it was easily to be seen that he was badly hurt. At the sight of Roland he muttered a curse. "Where's the money, Herr Förster?" he asked coolly. "Money? And if I knew, do you think I'd tell you? Go and let me die in peace." "The black bag which you were told to throw into the middle of the lake is a poor substitute for what I want. The notes are hidden in Herr Hochwald's room, nicht wahr?" Förster was in no condition to dissimulate, and his chin gave the slightest twitch upward. "Ah, "That is kind of you. If you will remain quite still, Herr Förster," continued Roland, "I will send a doctor to look after you. In the meanwhile I will take the liberty of locking the doors." Lamp in hand, he sought the room into which Kotkina had gone. It was luxuriously furnished with the trappings of a man, evidently the abode in times of peace of Count Monteori himself. First he searched the bathroom, with no results. There was a towel very much soiled upon the rack, and another upon the floor which showed traces of some dark stuff. Slovenly blighter, thought Roland as he went out into the bedroom. A bookshelf stood in one corner of the room. A likely place? But in a moment, with all the volumes strewn upon the floor, Roland had to acknowledge himself mistaken. He tried the bed next, ripping up the mattress and the pillows. The drawers of the bureau were empty, but he took them out one by one and examined the woodwork behind. Next he tested the chairs and couch without success. Then he stopped in disgust to sit down with a cigarette, scratch his head, and grin at the frightful disorder he had created. Where could Hochwald have hidden the money? He had been in the house less than 2 hours. Skillful camouflage would require a longer time than that. It must be something more obvious. A simple expedient, but clever, worthy of the talents of the gentleman who had locked him in the safe. He had examined the porcelain stove, a large affair which stood in one corner of the room, but there was nothing in it except a few old newspapers. Now, as he stared at it, a new thought came to him, and lighting his cigarette, he touched the fire from the match to the waste paper in the stove. The result was quite surprising, for smoke poured from every aperture, filling the room and driving Roland to open the window. No draught. He climbed on a chair and, lamp in hand, carefully examined the smoke pipe, his long subdued excitement growing again. There was half an inch of rust showing at the lower joint. He then got down from the chair and, thrusting in his arm, found the flue. At last found the aperture, and discovered at once the meaning of the lack of draught, for his fingers met something soft to the touch, which they closed on and with some difficulty drew forth. But when he moved the tightly wedged cloth, there was a commotion in the smoke pipe above, and as he drew forth the grimy towels which had stopped the hole, a heavy object fell into the smoldering ashes below, an oilcloth package, the appearance of which was familiar to him. Another, until in less than 10 minutes, in a sooty pile upon the rug, in an orderly row which tickled his fancy, were the 25 packages of banknotes of the vault of Nemi. He made no mistake this time, examining each one carefully in turn. Triumph! Hurriedly he packed them into the black bag. Clever? It was a wonder that he hadn't thought of it at first, especially after the sooty towels. A childish expedient, a temporary one at best, until Herr Hochwald and Herr Förster could find a way to hide the fortune more effectually. Roland now knew that it was he or Förster who had traced the bag to Berghof and killed him shortly after Berghof and Roland had parted in Munich. There was no time to lose. For the last half hour Roland hadn't dared to hope that he could be in time to reach the meeting. But now his sense of humor, long restrained, got the better of him, and he laughed outright as he snapped the catch of the bag and lifted his burden to reach the committee and formally restore the stolen funds. But how could he reach Munich now that the last train had gone? He hurried down the stairs. When, his precious bag beside him, he liberated the gasping Taglitz, and when the Prussian sat up bewildered, "You are to go at once to the village for a doctor for Herr Förster, who lies in the front room upstairs, badly wounded."
"Zu Befehl," muttered the bewildered man, "if you will but let me loose."
"Thanks, old top. And you might tell Herr Hochwald when you see him that the chimney has been cleaned. Verstehen Sie?"
"Zu Befehl,"
muttered the other. Roland hurried forth, crossed the terrace, and went carefully down the stone steps, and in a few minutes had untied the painter, taken up the oars, and pushed off. But as he cleared the terrace wall and came out into view of the house, there was a streak of flame from the upper window, and bullets splashed all around him. "Not so sick as he looked," he muttered. "Or maybe it's Ramses II." And then, just to show that he was feeling quite happy himself, Roland emptied the rest of his clip at the window, when the firing suddenly ceased. With a laugh he took up his oars and rowed for dear life toward the pavilion and Herr Bent's. That honest man was awaiting him, quite disturbed over the sounds of the shots, which informed him that Herr Roland had not come through his adventure without danger. "Herr Bent's, we are going to the meeting of the Central Committee in Munich." "Tonight? But how?" "In the ancient automobile, which is for hire at such an exorbitant price." "I don't know. It is late." "We shall find it. One can find anything in the world with 25 millions of francs." "Then you have——" The man's words choked him for sheer delight. Roland tapped the black bag affectionately and laughed. End of chapter 16.